My name is Callie. There we go. My name is Callie McCune, and I'm the Manager of Engagement at the Indiana Historical Society. It is great to have so many of you here tonight. I'm going to go over just a few pieces of logistics before I pass the mic over to our speakers. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do that by collecting paper-based items like books and letters, photographs, diaries, maps, and more that all tell Indiana's unique stories. And then we find unique ways to share them, whether that's publications, exhibitions, or events like this. It's through these documents that we tell the diverse stories of Indiana and inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Tonight, we're going to dive into the stories of Indiana in maybe a little bit of a different way by looking at the spooks and spirits that haunt our state. And I feel like there's no better time to talk about those than October, when it's just starting to get cold and everybody's in that mood. But before I hand it over to our moderator, Jessica, I have just a couple pieces of logistics. For tonight's event, Jessica and Dr. Hunt will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you have questions as we go along, please feel free to drop them in the question and answer section of your Zoom screen. We'll keep an eye on them and then pepper them in as we get to the second half of the program. If you'd like to add anything to the chat box, please feel free. Again, we'd love to know what you're drinking tonight, or your favorite ghost, or your comments as we go along the way. Just please make sure that you are replying to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see it. And keep an eye on that chat, where I'll be dropping links and URLs throughout the conversation. Don't worry if you missed one, we'll be delivering those to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow. And if you didn't catch it, this program is being recorded. You'll be able to catch the replay on our website, indianahistory.org, in the upcoming weeks. If you enjoy this program, we hope you'll consider coming back for more. Our history happy hours will continue on October 28th, where we're going to look at a murder mystery from Indiana's past. And then we'll finish out the year in December with a history happy hour about Santa Claus, Indiana. You'll be able to sign up for all that and find more about our virtual and in-person offerings at indianahistory.org. So with that, I'm going to toss this over to Jessica Fisher, who's our exhibitions research assistant at the Indiana Historical Society, to get us started. Hey, Jess, how's it going tonight?
Good. I am so ready for spooky talk. So we are here today with Dr. Tamara Hunt. Dr. Hunt is a professor of history and director of the Master of Arts in Liberal Studies at the University of Southern Indiana. She has a PhD from the University of Illinois in British history and has taught at the University of Illinois, Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and then of course USI. Her first book, Defining John Bull, was on English political caricature in the reign of George III, and she has co-edited a book called Women and the Colonial Gaze, which examine the ways in which ideologies of gender have been utilized as part of imperialism since at least the time of the ancient Romans. Her current research is studying early 18th century women, as well as the world of London publishing. So I'm going to start with our traditional question here on the History Happy Hour. Dr. Hunt, what is your drink tonight?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm drinking water.
Well, we already
I'm on campus, and there's no alcohol allowed on campus, and I probably wouldn't be drinking alcohol anyway, so.
That's fair. I'm right there with, I think it was Mike in the comments with my Coca-Cola. So I'm right there with you. That's okay. Our drinks don't have to be spooky because all the talk is spooky. So I kind of just want to start out. So your focus is British history. So how did you go from that to getting into Indiana ghost stories and studying the history behind those?
Well, part of that actually comes from just being a historian. Wherever I go, I'm interested in the history. And so when I moved to Indiana, it's like, well, I need to find out about Indiana history. In fact, when I came and interviewed for the job here at USI, and I saw what kinds of historical resources there were, I said, boy, I almost wish I were an American historian because I'd never have to leave town to do any research. But how I got into ghost stories, my husband is also a historian, and between the two of us, we have over 9,000 books. And I'd say about 1,000 of those have to do with ghosts and spirits. And I can't go to sleep at night unless I read something. But if I start to read a novel, there I am at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to keep my eyes open so I can keep reading the novel and find out what happens. So I started years ago reading short stories, and 19th century short stories are the best. British short stories from the 19th century. Well, a lot of those are ghost stories.
Okay.
And my absolute favorite ghost story writer is a man named M.R. James, Montague Road James. His ghost stories are just first rate. But you've got Dickens, you've got Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, you've got Ambrose Bierce, you've got, just everybody. Everybody wrote ghost stories in the 19th century.
Okay.
So I started reading them.
Yeah. So we know that you have some favorites there. What's your favorite Indiana ghost story?
Well, that actually is one that I came across fairly recently. I was doing some research on ghosts because among my other interests, I do actual formal research on ghost stories. And I came across a story that's based in Evansville in 1917. A woman and her daughter decided that they were going to use a Ouija board to try and contact the woman's son and obviously her daughter's brother. He died 10 years earlier by being electrocuted. At least that's what the story in the newspaper said. And so they contact the son, and on the Ouija board, the son spells out on the Ouija board, "Beware of Nat and Barb." And the mother and the daughter are taken aback because Nat and Barb are their neighbors across the street. And the mother actually scolds Henry and says, "Henry, you stop saying bad things about the neighbors." But all he'll respond is, "Beware of Nat and Barb." And so they finally say, "Okay, if that's all you're going to do is say nasty things, we're going to end for the evening." And they shut it down and they go to bed. And the mother is in bed when she hears a strange noise. And she gets up to investigate. And as she's turning the light on, Nat from across the street comes out from under her bed.
What?
Yes. And he flees the house. Okay, well, being a historian, one of the things I do when I investigate ghost stories is I go to look to see, are these real people? Because you have to understand that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers made things up. There are a lot of made up ghost stories that they have. So in this case, I had the names of the people, I had the addresses. So I went and looked, and I discovered that yes, this woman and her daughter did in fact live at the location they said she lived at, that she had a son who died 10 years earlier as a result of being electrocuted. And I found his death certificate. And then I looked at the city directories and I found that yes, indeed, Nat and Barb did live across the street from this woman and her daughter. But one of the reasons why this is one of my favorite stories is the next thing that I found out. This happened in 1917. And from the census records of 1920, guess where Nat was living in 1920? In the state insane asylum. Now, that's Henry knew what he was talking about when he was warning his mother and his daughter to beware of Nat and Barb, because she had a man who was later locked up for being crazy, hiding under her bed. So, yeah. And I think that you all might have an image of this. That's get a ghost as a bodyguard. That was what appeared in the newspapers. There was a great illustration of the women showing the Ouija session. So I don't know if you guys can find that and put it up or not, but
yeah, I think Callie's going to bring that up.
Okay.
Oh, that's great.
Well, that's one of the fun things about doing this ghost research. Another story that I really like has to do with Davies County Jail up in Washington. There's actually a newspaper report that said, and I believe it's from 1909. I'm not seeing the exact date, but I think it's 1909. And what the story reports, in all seriousness, is that the prisoners in the jail were complaining because it was haunted, and they were being kept awake at night with the sounds of someone strangling. And they attributed it to a suicide in which a prisoner had committed suicide by hanging. And this was reported in all seriousness, and the sheriff agreed that yes, indeed, that he'd heard the sounds. So it's just, this is the kind of story that, for people who want to say, well, ghost stories are a bunch of hooey. I don't know. I've got to wonder. These were people who really existed, who made these reports, and you have people who were supposedly reliable eyewitnesses, meaning the police officials. So, yeah, and they actually joked that the crime rate went down because people were too afraid to get arrested and go to jail.
Right. Well, you can't get away from the ghosts. You're stuck with them. Man. So can we go back to the Ouija board? I heard that there are some famous Hoosiers that really enjoyed using the Ouija board, and spiritualism, if you could talk a little bit about what that is.
Sure. Spiritualism was a belief that we have a start date for, which is 1848, and it developed out of some claims by these two women in upstate New York, the Fox sisters, who said that they could communicate with the ghost of a murdered peddler who was inhabiting their house. And this is a significant thing because there were people who believed that they got communications from spirits all through the 18th and 19th centuries. But the idea that you could talk back to them and communicate as a two-way communication was something that was relatively new. And one of the things that spirit mediums did, the idea would be that a spirit medium was someone who could easily communicate with the other side. They would go into trances and they might speak for the ghosts, but quickly they developed this idea of what we now call automatic writing. And that was that while the medium was in a trance, he or she would have a pencil and would be able to write what the ghost was dictating. Well, it didn't take long before they developed some kind of technology to deal with this. And what they developed was something called a planchette, which was a board that had a pencil sticking through it, and it had wheels on it. So you've got a tripod board that's usually in the shape of a heart, as they came to be. And that the people who were in the seance would put their hands on the board, and then the ghost would communicate. And while the board moved around, it was supposedly writing out words that people would be able to understand. Well, this idea of using a planchette was something that was very, very attractive to many people. And there was a sudden surge in interest in it. And one of the people who became convinced by spiritualism and became a confirmed spiritualist was Robert Dale Owen, very famous Hoosier. And they actually have a planchette, one of these boards with the pencil, that has been signed by Robert Dale Owen over in Missouri. I believe it's the Missouri Historical Society that has it.
Yeah, we've got that image up now, so.
Okay. So, and a company actually was developed later in the century to have a new development. I have to think that there were a lot of people who were disappointed with automatic writing because they couldn't read what was being written. Either the ghosts had bad handwriting or something else. So what they did is they developed a board, which they called a spirit board or a talking board, which used a planchette, but instead of having a pencil, it had a pointer on it. And this was the origin of the Ouija board. And there was this huge craze for Ouija boards. In fact, so much so that there was actually a polka that was written as a spirit board polka. So the Ouija boards really took off in the later 19th century. But if you ever want to see some really terrific examples of talking boards or Ouija boards, you have to look to the 1940s. At that time, they were really becoming much more of a toy than they were being treated seriously. But some of these are just fabulous in terms of their design. Some of them glow in the dark, which I think would be a neat thing to use.
And useful.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit because I kind of wanted to talk about one of Indiana's famous ghosts, the Gray Lady in Evansville. So can you talk a little bit about her?
Sure. I'm actually doing a deep dive. I will ultimately come out with scholarly articles on this because there's just too much good stuff to not get it published. But according to legend, the Gray Lady is supposed to be Louise Carpenter, the daughter of Willard Carpenter, the man who gave the money to found the Willard Library. And there are a couple things about this story that I think need to be revisited because I haven't been able to find any early mentions of the Gray Lady, and I've been looking. But according to legend, the first time she was seen was in 1937 by a maintenance man who'd gone into the library early in the morning to stoke up the furnace. And he'd seen this lady dressed in gray with a gray veil and all the rest of it. Well, the idea was that people had was that this must be Louise, and that she was haunting the library because she resented the fact that her father gave all that money to the library and disinherited her. Okay, that's the story. But here's the problem with the story. Louise wasn't disinherited by her father. She couldn't have been because he died without a will. And when you die without a will, that means that the state decides who gets what property. So he did not intentionally disinherit her when he died. And when his wife died, his wife inherited most of the estate. When his wife died the following year, she did leave money to her daughter. I admit it was $10,000, which at the time was a lot of money, but when you consider that he gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to the library, it's not a lot. In any case, Louisa, and I'm not going to get into the whole Carpenter family saga here, but there's some really scandalous stuff that goes on in the Carpenter's family. But Louisa apparently began to experience financial need. And in the 1890s, she did sue because she said that her father had been unduly influenced by the men who were the trustees of the Willard Library to give the money. And so she went to court and she ultimately lost the court case. But it's interesting because she lost the court case because they said she'd waited too long to file. Not that her case had no merit, but that she'd waited too long. Well, she moves to the East Coast with one of her daughters and ultimately dies there in, I believe it's 1907. Okay, and here's why I think that there's a problem with her being the Willard Library ghost. I don't know why she'd want to go and haunt there, because she had not spent a lot of time there, having moved away.
It seems like she resented it a little too.
Yeah, but in addition to that, if she died, why did it take her 30 years to begin haunting the building? Because I can't find anybody who said that there's any earlier reports of haunting before 1937. I actually think that it's more likely that the Gray Lady is actually one of the librarians, because the Willard Library had 3 women librarians who served for decades. And I mean, they practically died in harness. The one who died closest to 1937 was Catherine Imbush. She died in 1930. But there was also a woman named Tilly Gosley and Lou Scanlon who died earlier than that. And I think any one of those 3 would make a much more likely person to haunt. I mean, if you spent every day of your life for 30 years in a location and you loved it and you loved your work, why not go back there?
Right.
Check and see everything's going okay. Make sure everybody's doing things the way they need to do them. So.
Makes sense to me. I don't know if I would want to haunt my place of work for the rest of my life, but I could see it. Library is a good place to hang out. So with that story, there seem to be like some inconsistencies with how people have told it. And I was curious, do you often find those inconsistencies when you're researching Indiana's ghost stories? And like, how do these stories get perpetuated? How do those errors, if we will, get perpetuated?
Well, it's interesting because if you look in the 19th century and 19th century sources, it's really clear that there are certain conditions that people think must produce a ghost. They ought to produce a ghost. So if you have a really terrible murder, and we have a couple of those here in southern Indiana, where people believe that because the murder was so terrible, that either the people who were murdered or the murderer should be haunting that place. And so you hear accounts of, oh, people were frightened by this ghost who appeared in this location. So, but you know, the other thing that you see is that stories get perpetuated and told by people who think that they know what actually happened, but who don't. And I have an example of a ghost story that was told in the 1980s, and it was reported in the newspaper in 1980. And these people here in Evansville claimed that they had a ghost who moved with them, that the ghost had been in their original house, and that when they finally moved after years, it took a while, but the ghost finally came with them. And they described the ghost as a tall young man with blonde hair because they'd seen him. And so when the newspaper investigated and asked them questions about this story, the family told them, oh, well, we know who this ghost is. This is the ghost of Oscar. And they said Oscar had been a young man who lived in the house that they first lived in when it was a boarding house. And that one night this young man had gone out riding with his friends and came back home and went to bed and never woke up again. So he had a mysterious death, young man cut off in the prime of life. And so he was obviously the ghost. So because I had names and addresses, being the good historian that I am, I went to look to see if I could find them. And what I discovered is that, yes, indeed, there was not one, but there were 2 men who were named Oscar who had lived in that house before this family moved in. But here's the problem. One of the men named Oscar died years before, almost 20 years before the family moved in. Okay. And when he died, he was 54 years old. So, and on top of that, I had his draft records from World War I, so I could see that he was about 5'6", and he was described as dark and basically stocky. So he doesn't match the apparition as described by the family. So this Oscar probably can't be it. He dies of natural causes when he's 54. Now, the other man named Oscar looked like a much more likely person because he was a young man when he lived there. And I didn't see anything that said that he had died in the house. So I started looking for him, and I looked and I looked and I looked, and I found out, well, he couldn't be the Oscar either. And the reason is that this ghost story was being reported in 1980, but this Oscar didn't die until 1996. So I looked in the newspapers, I looked for reports to see, did anybody die in this house under those circumstances? And I couldn't find any reports that suggested that they did. So I'm not saying that these people didn't have a ghost, but they're telling a story about the ghost that doesn't jive with the facts. Now, I have to admit that I might actually be guilty of doing the same thing. Because when my husband and I moved to Evansville, we came here from Los Angeles and we had 3 days to find a place to live. And I am a cautious person in many respects, and I'm not buying a house in 3 days in a strange place. So we found a house to rent. And we quickly discovered that there was something a little bit unusual about the house that we were living in. It wasn't a terribly old house. And when we talked to the people next door, it was an elderly couple. We found out that the house had been built by a contemporary of our neighbors. And in fact, that our neighbor had helped this man to build it. And the man's name was Chester. And we came to believe that the ghost must have been Chester. And the reason for that is this. Chester tidied up after us. I had one of the bedrooms in the house was my home office. And there were several times where I was in a hurry. I grabbed something off my desk in the office and the papers fell on the floor. Other papers fell on the floor. And I'd go out and do whatever it was I was going to do, then come back to pick up the papers and they'd be back on the desk. And my husband had been on another floor of the house the entire time. And I'm sorry, our cats don't have opposable thumbs. So I don't think there's any way for them to pick those papers up and put them back on the desk. But the most extraordinary incident occurred when my husband was going to string a new clothesline outside. And he put the clothesline on the counter. Then he went and got the ladder and went outside with the ladder. Came back in to get the clothesline and it wasn't there anymore. He looked all over the house and couldn't find it. So he finally called me at my office and he said, I can't find it. What do I do? And I said, tell Chester to give it back. So he said, Chester, give it back. Went back into the counter and it was back on the counter.
Oh my gosh.
So it was never scary. And I don't know how to explain these things, but we always said this was Chester and Chester was giving us a message that we needed to go trim the weeds or we needed to go do something. If he was messing with us, it was because we needed to take care of something.
Man, I think we all need a Chester in our lives. So you put a lot of research into like finding all of the background nitty gritty on these stories. So can you go more into depth, like how you research these stories and how, like, if somebody that maybe isn't necessarily a historian but wants to research it, like how would our attendees today go about digging into their own ghost stories?
Well, I have to say that anybody who's interested in doing this, you first want to become really familiar with your local history resources. So if you got a local historical society or the Indiana State folks who are hosting this, they've got tons of great stuff. So one of the things I do is I look for ghost stories in a variety of places, but one of the places I look for them is newspapers. Now, there are two places to go find newspapers that I use regularly. There are subscription services, but if you want to use free services, there's Hoosier State Chronicles, which is Indiana newspapers, but the Library of Congress also has something called Chronicling America, which is newspapers across the United States from 1777 to 1963. And if you have a particular name that you're going to search, you can do that. One thing to be careful about is that people use the words ghost and spirits in other contexts. So for example, if you do a search for spirits in the newspaper, you might get things that are related to the Holy Spirit, for example. And ghost, you'd be amazed at how many times you find the phrase, the ghost of a chance in newspapers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So apparitions, however, is fairly fruitful because they tend to use apparitions when they're referring to ghosts. Now, once I locate these ghost stories, if they've got addresses and names and things like that, I turn to my good friend Ancestry.com. because Ancestry.com has census records, it has birth and death records, it has for a lot of these people, particularly, well, for the men in particular, I've looked at their draft registration cards to get information about them. So you can actually find out a lot about your local community by doing this kind of research. And I have to say, I love old newspapers.
Yeah.
And I very frequently get distracted because I want to read the whole newspaper and, oh, look at all this stuff that was going on at this time. So
yeah, I definitely.
But you'd also be surprised at how many of these newspapers have ghost stories all the time. I mean, on a regular basis. And I'll tell you, one Indiana newspaper that really seems to go to town on telling ghost stories is the Richmond Palladium and Sun Telegram. For some reason, they have all these ghost stories that they're constantly reporting on, both Indiana ones and ghost stories from elsewhere.
That's cool. I definitely would love to second Ancestry.com. I use it all the time and I fall down a rabbit hole with that. And that's something that like you can come to IHS and access it or go to the public library and access it. So like you don't even have to pay for it. It's a great resource. So we've got about 10 more minutes here. Let's see. Talking about the History Center, like we get asked all the time if our building is haunted. It's for all of you that are wondering, it's not. It was built in the 90s. Nothing bad's ever happened there. But I know that like other buildings are a big place that you hear about ghost stories in connection with. And there are a lot of ghost stories in connection with campuses. I mean, obviously a campus is full of building after building. So what are some good like campus ghost stories that you know of?
Well, I just want to say one thing about your building being haunted. A building doesn't have to be old to be haunted.
That's a good point.
You know, you'll watch on TV and you'll see these ghost shows where they're saying ghosts do this and ghosts do that. Well, we don't really know. Okay. Nobody knows exactly what ghosts can and can't do, or even if there are such things as ghosts. But I don't know what's to stop a ghost from saying, I like the look at that building. I think I'll go hang out there for a while. Or maybe they like you and they say, we want to go hang out with Jessica. So,
I mean, I'd welcome that. You can hang out with me while I'm working.
What I found surprising, I teach a course here on campus called The Social History of Ghosts. And one of the things I found out was our campus is very new. USI was founded in 1965 and it became an independent campus in 1985. And our buildings are really pretty new. And I didn't think that there would be ghost stories connected with this campus. So I asked one of my classes one year, so there aren't any campus ghost stories, are there? I was amazed at how many campus ghost stories there were. And of course, they were based on things that hadn't really happened. The most famous kinds of ghost stories on campuses tend to be connected with the older buildings on campus. So if you've got fairly old buildings, particularly buildings that have wood floors that creak a lot, and maybe an old elevator and a tower, because what you'll find is that they'll tell stories about that building, that there was, and it almost always revolves around a suicide, that somebody killed themselves in this building. And so now their ghost is constantly haunting it. And there's the ghost of a musician who comes back and plays on the piano that's locked away in the attic. And so things like that. But then, of course, when you ask about details, you can't ever get any. What was the name of the student? Well, it was just a student.
Just a random student somewhere. So there are themes with that then of like, you know, like you said, like the suicide is a theme and that happened. You always hear that in connection with buildings. What about themes around other things like haunted bridges and things like that?
Oh, Indiana is filled with haunted bridges. The stories vary, but there are bridges that have haunted brides. There are bridges that have demonic dogs. There are bridges that have all kinds of different, and in fact, some of these bridges have different stories for the same bridge. So
Okay.
that's interesting. But another place that really tends to attract ghost stories is theaters.
Oh,
And
yeah.
theater ghosts are famous. And you can understand why, because these are places where people expended a lot of emotion while they were putting on their performances, and they love being in front of the floodlights, and oh, well, then maybe they never want to leave. So
Right. Okay, let's see here. So, so you said like a building doesn't have to necessarily be old to be haunted. So what, like we were talking a little bit beforehand about IHS and how our building might not be haunted, but maybe the collections are haunted. So like, what are some other ways that hauntings have sort of perpetuated?
well, I don't know if any of you have ever heard the story of the Dybbuk Box, which to me is one of the most frightening stories I think I've ever heard. The Dybbuk Box is a real box that was bought at an auction, or I'm sorry, at an estate sale, it's a yard sale. And apparently the person was warned not to open this box. And it's just a little box with doors on it.
Mhm.
But the person did open it. And supposedly the Dybbuk Box was created in the 1930s in Europe in order to imprison a demon in the box. And that the person who bought the Dybbuk Box and opened it up suddenly had all kinds of really bad luck, including medical problems and deaths in the family. So he closed it all out, all up, and went to and tried to sell it. And the next person he sold it to, same thing, bad luck, haunting type activity. Finally, it was bought by a man who was going to investigate it because he was an anthropologist. Same thing, bad luck, ill health, deaths. And the last I heard of the Dybbuk Box is that it's stored in a secret location where he's not going to tell anybody where it is, in the hopes that it will keep its evil there. But oh, there are other haunted objects. For example, there's a doll in a museum in Key West, Florida, called Robert. And
Yeah.
Robert, you've heard about Robert?
Heard of Robert, yeah.
He moves around, yeah. And
Mhm.
he's supposed to be rather malevolent as well. So yeah, there are a lot of stories of haunted objects that you'll find. And of course, that guy who's on Ghost Adventures, and I'm going to be upfront right now, I hate Ghost Adventures.
Okay.
But he's got a haunted museum, he claims. But I just saw somebody in chat said that there's a Dybbuk Box owned by the Ghost Adventures guy. It's entirely possible he bought it. So
Okay. Well, we are ready to transition to questions from our audience. I like ending on that spooky note. So let's see what you guys all had to ask here. So one of the first questions we had is, what is considered to be the most haunted place in Indiana?
wow.
Throw a big one at you.
Well, I'm going to say, just from sense of localism, the Willard Library. But the Crown Point Jail is also supposed to be haunted as well. And to me, that would be the one that that springs to my mind, other than the Willard Library.
Okay, can you, like, what's that? Because I've not heard that story before. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Supposedly there was, and I'm looking for it here, there was a ghost that was supposedly heard and seen in there, And this is one of the places where when it was reported, I believe it was 1909, the idea is that the ghost made so much noise and was so unpleasant that it too was experiencing a drop in crime.
Okay.
But the interesting part about that is that that particular story was linked. When I found it in the newspaper, that particular story was actually overshadowed by the rest of the newspaper article, which talked about the first millionaire policewoman. And she joined the police force to help unfortunate women. And she supposedly, oh, I'm sorry, that's Muncie Jail. That was the millionaire policewoman.
Okay.
But they were more interested in her than they were in the supposedly haunted jail.
That's fair. I'm cool with that. So kind of along the same lines, where are the best places to go in Indiana to find true hauntings?
Well, if you want to know where to go for what I consider to be the best ghost walk in Indiana, I'd say New Harmony, because they do a really first-rate job. They get the history right, which for me is really important. But there's a lot of ghostly possibilities over in New Harmony.
And that's Southern Indiana, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
New Harmony is about 30 miles from where I am right now.
Okay.
But I've also heard about French Lick, West Baden, as being another site. But you can pretty much find ghost stories everywhere in the state. And I mean everywhere in the state. Indianapolis, I know, has a lot of different ghost stories connected to older homes, some municipal buildings. So.
Okay. So the next question is very timely. Are there any stories or, anything related that you know of that has had a direct impact on Halloween traditions in Indiana?
I can't think that I have. I have to say that Halloween traditions, they've really changed significantly over time. There's a really great book it's called Trick or Treat, and it's the history of Halloween, which traces the history from the Reformation period to the present. And I don't know if you know this, but the traditional time for telling ghost stories in Britain is Christmas. And so the idea of moving it backwards to October is something that's a bit unusual, and it developed here in this country. But I don't know that there's anything particularly in Indiana that would shape it, because we've really become much more attuned to horror than hauntings for Halloween. If you look at a lot of costumes, not many people go as ghosts anymore, but they're going to go as people with an axe through their head or something like that. Now, I guess that could be a ghost, but so. But I don't know of anything in particular in Indiana.
Okay. So sticking with Indiana, where would you suggest people go to, be it websites or books or anything like that, to learn some more about haunted or ghostly Indiana stories?
Well, there's at least 4 volumes, and there might be more by now, of Haunted Indiana. And each book has about, I'd say about 8 stories of particular haunted locations. And they're really fairly well written. They do cover all areas of the state. And so I would say, yeah, that would be a place to start. And there's a lot of stuff out there where you can find ghost stories. There's a book, and I can't remember the author of it, but it's called Indiana Folktales, and it's an older book. It was published in the 1980s.
Oh, is it Linda?
No, it's a man. It's a man who published it. And of course, all my ghost books are at home, so I can't just pull it out of the bookshelf. But what he did in the Indiana folk tales, he has a lot of folk tales, but he also has specifically ghost tales. So for those of you who are asking about haunted bridges and things like that, that would be a resource to go to, because what he did is he went during the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration had interviews and they recorded these interviews. Well, he went through these interviews with people in Indiana to call out the folk tales. And there are a lot of different ghost stories that people told. And it's very interesting because if you go and you look at these, you're going to see they're telling stories that are similar, but the details change. And so if you ever want to see about how ghost stories can change and alter, that's a really good example of it, because these people are telling these stories that they've heard from when they were children, and the details do shift.
Right. So obviously, like you're saying, everybody tells their ghost story. They have different versions of it. Are there places that people can go to like submit their ghost stories and kind of add to the collective Indiana ghost story narrative?
I'm right offhand, I'm not familiar with anybody who's doing that, but if you want to send them to me, I'd happily take them. So
good to know. Let's see.
Someone just put up on chat, Hoosier Folk Tales by Ronald Baker. That's it. That's the book I was referring to.
Okay, thank you, whoever put that up there. So let's see here. What other questions do we have? So do you think that people are more interested in ghost stories like today, or like is it an enduring interest, or is it something that like was more popular back during, you know, when spiritualism was popular, or like how has that interest shifted over time?
Well, there are ghost stories as far back as recorded history. I mean, there just are. And this is one of the things we look at in my social history of ghosts, because the meaning of ghosts changes over time. And in the 18th century, when we have the Enlightenment, Age of Reason, and all of that, a lot of elites in society thought, oh, this is going to be the end of the ghost, because only ignorant, superstitious people believe in them. But there's this whole blossoming of interest in ghosts. And I have to say that one of the things I think that was going on there is that at the same time you got the Age of Reason, you also have the Industrial Revolution, and things are becoming much more machine-like, and some of the beauty of nature is being lost as factories expand. And was it that people wanted to think that there was something more out there than going to a factory and working all the time? Now, in the 20th century, it's interesting because ghost beliefs shift according to what's going on. For example, in World War I, there was an upswing, a dramatic upswing in belief in ghosts and in spirits. And I'm sure that was related to the enormous destruction of the war and the enormous loss of life in the war. But even on the battlefield, what you see is soldiers became interested in good luck charms and omens and things like that. And I would have to say that has to be related to the fact that they didn't know if they were going to die in the next 5 minutes. So then we see a similar thing happening in World War II. And in the aftermath of World War II, there's, I think this is really interesting. There was an upswing in beliefs in magic and the supernatural in Germany after World War II. Mm-hmm. And it's been proposed that maybe people were looking for some kind of spiritual aid or assistance or interpretations to understand what they've gone through. The modern interest in ghost stories is, you may laugh at this, but the modern interest in ghost stories, most scholars think, is an outgrowth of the X-Files. Because the X-Files was so popular, and it raised all these questions, but it raised them in a way in which there was always the person who was the believer and the skeptic. And right. So you had a dialogue about what this was. And this really did produce an uptick in interest in ghosts and the supernatural. And I have to say, the surveys that are being done say that the belief in ghosts and the supernatural is increasing.
Okay. That's kind of exciting. I love that people are getting interested in it and, you know, enjoying the spookiness. So let's see here. So we have several questions that are wanting to know about very specific places. So one of them is the House of Blue Lights. Do you have any knowledge on that and that story?
Which one is it?
I'm
more than
assuming the one in Indianapolis.
Okay. I don't have anything on that. I'm afraid I haven't looked at that. But there are multiple places where people report that they see blue lights inside houses that are vacant. And so that actually is something that is not unusual. That and I actually have an example of where that was actually exposed to be a prank. Where a neighbor wanted to scare his wife and his neighbors, and so he went into a deserted hospital and created this ghostly phenomena. You know, though, here's the thing. In the 19th century, you had to be careful about doing that kind of thing, because there's a case from here in Evansville where a local farmer decided that he was going to scare his neighbor, and he dressed up like a ghost and went and jumped out behind him and I guess said boo or something. Well, he did this while the neighbor was chopping wood, and the neighbor turned around and killed him with the axe.
Oh,
Because he thought it was a ghost. Now, here's the unusual thing about this story. The prankster was white and the guy who was scared was black. And I followed up on that story, and they didn't do anything to the African-American man, even though he killed a white farmer, because they said he was justified in being frightened by this event. And this was a story that was reported all over the United States.
Right.
I found this in newspapers all across the United States.
Man. So another one that we want to talk a little about, actually, real quick plug, by the way, if you want to learn more about the Indianapolis House of Blue Lights, come to IHS. We've got our Indiana Lore exhibit, which is running until November 6th, and you can learn a little bit more about that there. So that's my personal plug, but we'll get back to the questions, which I think we have time for maybe one more. So we're going to go with another specific place. A lot of people were interested in the Circus Train wreck in Hammond, Indiana.
Yes. Yeah, that let me get the actual dates here. Okay. That's the Haagenbeck Wallace Circus Train, right? That we're talking about? Okay. If you don't know the story of this, the Haagenbeck Wallace Circus Train was going from one show to another, and it was in two different trains. And I'm so glad that the animals were on the first train, okay? Because the first train got to where they were going, okay? But it was the second train that had the problem. The circus train, this is where the performers were, and they were sleeping in their bunks at the back of the train. And another train, which should have stopped and which should have seen the stoplights, didn't, because the engineer fell asleep. And he plowed into the back of the circus train at full speed. And there were people who were killed in the crash, but this is the really horrible, tragic part of this. The cars were lit by gasoline lamps. And the gasoline spread everywhere, and people who survived the crash ended up dying from burning to death. Well, 86 people died that night, and many of the bodies were too badly burned to be identified. Now, you may know the more famous story of this supposed haunting. These bodies were buried in a mass grave in Forest Park, Illinois, and in a place called Showman's Rest. And I went to school in Chicago. My sister lives in Chicago, so I know this one. People who went to Showman's Rest declared that they could hear the spirits of the animals who were elephants trumpeting and things like that at Showman's Rest. So they were saying Showman's Rest was haunted. Well, as I just said, the animals were on the first train, so none of them died. And the question was, well, why are animals haunting this? Well, what they discovered is that the Brookfield Zoo is less than a mile away from Showman's Rest in a straight line. So when people went there in the evenings in particular, the animals were just being fed. And so the animals of Brookfield Zoo were making a commotion because they were getting fed, and people thought that this was a haunting there. But train wrecks are a real sight in which people regularly report ghostly occurrences. All over the country, but also in Indiana. There are numerous places where there are train accidents. And after that, they report that there are ghostly sightings. There are sightings of engineers, sightings of the train itself. If you supposedly on the anniversary of the Haagenbeck Wallace Circus Train wreck, if you go out there on the anniversary, you'll hear ghostly screams and cries. To be honest, I wouldn't want to go there if that's actually what I'm going to hear, because I can't think this would be at all pleasant. But in any case, that location is supposed to be haunted, and it's supposed to peak at the anniversary of its of the wreck.
Okay, well, that is terrifying, but also the elephant story is a little silly. So I think that's a great note to wrap up on. So thank you, Dr. Hunt, for being with us tonight and telling us about all the cool ghost stories in Indiana. And I will throw it back to Kelly.
Thank you both. I had a great time, and I will say our chat was full of cat ghost conversations, which also just made my night. So thank you everyone for having a great chat tonight. If you enjoyed this program, we hope you'll consider coming back for more. As I mentioned at the top of the program, we have more history happy hours coming to an internet connected device near you. Join us on October 28th as we dive into a historic murder from Indiana's past, and stay tuned for more coming up in December. You can dive into your family's history at our Genealogy 101 workshop on Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Jump onto your computer and find out more about how you can bring your ancestors' life to life with Amy Vedra, our Director of Reference Services. And if more in your person is more your style these days, and you're in the Indy area, come join us on Friday, October 22nd for Whodunit, our annual murder mystery event. We'll turn our historical society into a giant clue game where you get to solve a historic Indiana murder, question suspects, look for evidence, and figure out the who, with what, and the motive. It's a great time. You can find out about all of that at the link that's going into the chat or at indianahistory.org. We'll post this conversation to IHS's YouTube channel and our website in the upcoming weeks. In the meantime, if you'd like to revisit any of our previous conversations, you can learn about cemeteries, underwear, donuts, and lots of things in between. You can find that at indianahistory.org/virtual resources. And if you missed a chance to donate or would like to make a further gift to support the Indiana Historical Society, please visit the link that is coming into the chat. Your donation allows us to continue to share Hoosier stories and provide programs like this. Last but not least, you're going to get an email from us tomorrow morning. It's going to have a bunch of links, some tips on how to start researching your own ghost stories from Dr. Hunt, and a survey. It'll take 1 minute. We'd love to know what you thought, what you think of programs like this, and what you want to hear about next year as we're starting to plan for 2022. So with all of that, we hope that you stay safe and stay healthy. Have a great spooky season, and we can't wait to see you at a program soon. Bye, everybody.